Today we are going to talk about characteristics of Middle English period. Earlier I have talked about the characteristics of Old English period. If you haven't watched this video till now, you can watch it going to the playlist on the name of Old English period and take benefit of this video. And now we are going to talk about Middle English period. Features of Middle English literature. A greater part of Middle English literature was imitative. The literature of the time was imitative. The introduction of French culture and language after the Norman Conquest. Norman Conquest took place in 1066 and the Normans were, you can say, French people, and that's why their language was Norman, and this influenced the native thought and culture. French became the language of aristocracy because they were ruler, and Latin was the language of the court. Thus, during this time, the English people tried to imitate the themes and fashion of French and Latin literature. They tried to copy or imitate the themes and fashion of French and Latin literature. The anonymous nature of the writing was still evident, and it was clear that the literature of the time was anonymous because the works written by the writers of the time without their names, and that's why it is said that the literature of the time was anonymous. A large part of medieval literature was basically religious, and the medieval literature mostly was religious, and there was overall importance of church, and the importance and the dominance of church was prevalent at that time, and a large number of authors were clerics, and the authors belongs to clerk classes at that time. The concern over moral values, edification, and instruction, even when religion was not a major concern, made the literature didactic. And the literature of the time was didactic, means the preaching. It was like a preaching because moral values were emphasized at that time, and instruction and edification were given to the people to taught them moral values. That's why the literature of the time was didactic. It was essentially an oral literature. It was meant to listen rather than read. This was a major reason for the anonymity of the works. The very reason is that the literature of the time was oral, and oral, which is not written, means that the narration goes from one generation to next by mouth, and not by writing or by written material. And this was a major reason, and that is the reason that the works were anonymous without the name of authors, because at that time they preferred to listen rather than read. Domination of poetry was another characteristics of the age. The only other literary genre was prose writing, and it was still at its nascent age, means it was at its initial age, and the domination of poetry was there. And following are the different forms of Middle English poetry. That is, a large number of verse chronicles were composed. Lemon's Brood was the most famous of them, and it was famous verse poem, Lemon's Brood. Religious and didactic poetry include the Owl and the Nightingale, and the other one is the Owl and the Nightingale. It was didactic one, and the next is Ormulum and the Cursor Mundi, other notable poems. The romances of the period mostly dealt with the chivalry of historical heroes of England, France, and Rome. The romances mostly dealt with bravery, you can say, of historical heroes of England, France, and Rome. A variety of them were connected closely, loosely with King Arthur. This was the famous name of the time. The prevailing subjects were of martial and amatory nature, with an additional interest in the supernatural. and the subjects were martial, you can say martial and military nature, and it added with the next interest, that is supernaturalism. The objects which are, you can say, unimaginable, which is, you can say, heavenly, or these kinds of elements were introduced at that time. Here amatory means love, you can see. We have talked about the verse and now it is prose. The anchorin rebele, which means rule of the anchoracesis, was the most important and most influential prose text of the period. And this is the prose text. The anchorin rebele. The development of rhymed meters, which in general displays the alliterative line. Alliterative verse, you remembered, I have talked about it in old characteristics feature of Old English period, if you remembered it. And it displaced with the rhymed meters line of Old English poetry was one of the main features of the period, and that was the main feature. Rhymed meters were introduced at that time. For the first time, lyrical poetry was introduced in Middle English period. The development of lyrical poetry is the greatest appeal of the period for a modern reader. There is no example of the true lyrical from the Old English period, and there was no, you can say, existence or example or prevalence of lyrical poetry in Old English period, and he this genre was introduced in Middle English period. Another feature was courtly love. This is the court that find a relationship between aristocratic love in Western Europe. There were some requirements for courtly love. Their requirements were elaborated and fulfilled by Roman poets. Courtly love was also a great feature of Middle English period, and it was prevalent in aristocratic, you can say, aristocracy class. The Roman poets emphasized and introduced the idea in their text or literature with courtly love. Example of courtly love is a knight show was in love with a married woman, and knight, the example of courtly love was is that knight fell in love with a married woman of high rank or high worth, required to prove his heroic deed, and it was believed that a knight should you can say prove his heroic deeds, as well as presenting love letter to his beloved with disclosing his identity, means revealing his identity. And chivalry means bravery or showing martial techniques. Is a code of conduct associated with a middle institute of knighthood developed in the medieval ages, and this connect himself to the medieval institute of knighthood developed in the medieval ages, and it belongs to knight mainly, and he shows his adventurous task of chivalry, showing bravery. Peasants Revolt, other characteristics of Middle English period, also called Vote Tellers Rebellion, and it took place in 1381. First great popular rebellion in English history, and this was the first great popular rebellion, you can say revolt. Its immediate cause was the imposition of unpopular poll tax of 1381, and the very, you can say, immediate cause of this rebellion is the unpopular poll tax of 1381, which brought to had economic discontent, and that brought economic dissatisfaction among peoples, and that had been growing since the middle of the century, and it was growing from a long time, and now it took place as a peasants revolt. The next feature is Black Death, pandemic that ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, and it ravaged and completely, you can say, destroyed Europe between 1347 and 1351, and it took greater toll of life, and thousands and lakhs of peoples were died due to this pandemic. And it was the you can say the first known epidemic, or you can say till war. Up to that time, this was the huge crisis of the time. Take care. God bless you.